So I'll start off with a little background. In 2010, I started as a postdoctoral research assistant on the project VERA, which stands for Virtual Embodiment and Robotic Re-embodiment. So virtual embodiment involves giving individuals the illusion of being embodied in something like an avatar, in something in a virtual environment. Robotic re-embodiment gives the illusion of being embodied in a robot, so being in control of a robot. And I'll give you an example of that in a little while. As you heard just now, my role in the project was to be the ethicist. So Thomas and I were the philosophers on the project. Our role was to investigate the ethics of the research itself and the ethical risks once this technology goes into the general public. And it was a great privilege to work on this project. So we were the only philosophers. Everybody else in the picture are engineers, computer scientists, roboticists, and so on. So it was a great privilege to work on this project, although it did have challenges in the beginning. At our beginning meetings, I heard a lot of things like, here comes the ethics guy. Watch what you say. What's he doing here? So yeah, 6 years ago, who knew that there were things to talk about with ethics in VR? The scientists on the project didn't really know why I was there, and I didn't really know why I was there. So it was a nice opportunity to explore really a new field, and that's what I've done over the past 6 years. It's culminated in this article. Robert said a few minutes ago that we need to have some guidelines. We need to start talking about the ethics. And this is what we tried to do in this article that was published in February. It's published in Frontiers in Robotics and AI, which is an open access free publication, so you can all go and view it and download it and share it and tweet about it. We tried to identify, as you can see in the title, a comprehensive list, a first list. We know there's a lot more to talk about. The technology is changing very quickly, but this is just a first list of possible ethical concerns. Now, as Robert also said, nobody's going to read a 30-page paper, academic paper. So we know that too. So at the end of the paper, we included bullet points. So skip to the end if you must. There's a table at the end where we have our concrete recommendations. The first half of the table is for research ethics. The second half of the table is for consumer use. And what I'll do for our time today, for the next 15 minutes or so, is tell you a little bit about the highlights. I won't really focus on the research ethics because that's not really the topic of our meeting today. I'll focus on recommendations for use by the general public. I'm not going to cover all of these. As I say, go to the paper if you want the details. But I'll cover what I take to be some of the most urgent and interesting points to talk about. Our approach was evidence-based, so we wanted to look at results from psychology, results from neuroscience, results from experiments within VR to answer the question, what are the risks? What do we need to be concerned about? And one line of results that I take to be very important are results from social psychology. So it's well known from social psychology going back decades that our environment can have a powerful, unconscious influence on our behavior. I'm sure many of you know the Milgram obedience experiments where subjects administered what they thought to be possibly lethal shocks just because they were told to by an authority figure. The Stanford prison experiment where there's role-playing going on. Students are role-playing as wardens and prisoners, and it got nasty very quickly. It became, the two groups became very hostile towards one another, and the experiment had to be shut down. I like the Ash conformity experiment. It's not so well known as the other two, but I really like it. It's a situation where subjects are put in a situation where they're given a simple visual matching task. And the answer to the task is obvious. It's like, match which line matches another line in length. But they're put in a condition where other people in the room, who they think are just other people in the experiment, answer the question before they do. And the other people in the room answer it incorrectly. They've been instructed to answer it incorrectly. And then when the actual subject in an experiment comes to you and you say, oh, geez, am I going to disagree with everybody? And many, I think something like 3/4 of the subjects answered incorrectly to conform. They knew the answer was wrong, but they said the wrong answer just to conform. So those are classic experiments. And then just the last one I want to mention, more recently, there were, the setting of the experiment was in a university break room where there's a donation jar for coffee. And in the control condition, there was a neutral picture above the donation jar. So the idea is, you're supposed to donate money for how much coffee you drink. And there's a neutral picture, say a picture of a house or a flower. And then in the experimental condition, there's just a pair of eyes hung up watching you above the. And yeah, and people donated 3 times as much money with the eyes watching them. So it's a very subtle environmental manipulation, but it has behavioral effects. So why is that important for us? Well, it's important for us because VR creates a situation in which not just one little sign in the environment, but the entire environment is determined by creators of the virtual world. Creators of the virtual world who may not have the best interests of the users in mind. So that situation introduces opportunities, I think, for new and perhaps especially powerful forms of psychological manipulation. We've heard a lot about how VR can give us an illusion about where we are, an illusion of a place illusion. But it can also give us an illusion about who we are, or at least what kind of bodies we inhabit. And this is, yeah, the video is working. This is a very simple illusion that was discovered, I think, around 1998, known as the rubber hand illusion. And you can do it for yourself. There's a rubber hand. The subject's real hand is hidden from her own view. She sees the rubber hand in a biologically realistic position, so where her own hand could be. And then there's tactile simulation that's synchronous. You see, if it's on her middle finger, it's on her hand. So she sees the rubber hand receiving the same tactile simulation at the same time that her real hand feels it. And when the experiment works, she feels an ownership, a sense of ownership for the rubber hand. You can try it at home with it's a wonderful illusion because it's so easy to do. You can try it at home with a rubber dish glove, stuff it with some cotton, and it shows us that our own sense of embodiment is, in a sense, fragile. That we're constantly, if you will, our brain is constantly asking, where am I? Where's my body? Where am I located? What am I doing? Am I in control? Am I moving because it's self-generated movement, or is somebody else moving? So there's this, as we call it in the paper, a self-model that's continuously created and recreated. And what we see with this experiment is it's very easy to manipulate that self-model, to manipulate our sense of who we are. Well, if we can have a sort of out-of-hand experience with this, we say, well, let's try to do an out-of-body experience. So some of the colleagues from the Vera project, I think this is from a paper from 2009, used a video camera. It's a relatively simple setup, a video camera 2 meters behind the participant, and then the output of the video camera is into the participant's goggles. So he sees the back of his own body appears to be 2 meters in front of him. And then, just like with the rubber hand experiment, you have that tactile simulation. So he sees the back of his own body being brushed as he feels it being brushed. And when the experiment works well, he has it would be a little dramatic to call it an out-of-body experience, but it's a sort of drift, a sort of a sense of ownership, sense that the virtual body that he sees is his own. Now, so we can manipulate the sense of embodiment. VR gives us a great way to do that, especially if you're going to incorporate tactile simulation or haptics. What about using illusions of embodiment for experiments in VR? And Robert alluded to this experiment as well. This is Tabitha Peck out of Mel Slater's lab, where subjects were embodied into a darker-skinned avatar. And 3 days before the experiment, they were given an implicit racial bias test. During the experiment, they were put into the body of a dark-skinned avatar. And then immediately after the experiment, they were given the same test, an implicit racial bias test. And it worked. It was a beneficent application. It made them less racist. They performed better on the test. So what this shows us, or what this suggests, is that experiences in VR can have unconscious influences on behavior that last after we leave the virtual environment. we recommend that users should be made aware of that evidence. They should be made aware that, not in an outrageous or histrionic way, but just to say there is evidence that that experiences in VR can have a lasting effect after you leave the virtual environment. Now, the experiments that have been conducted typically are on the order of minutes. The subjects aren't in the virtual environment for very long, say 10 minutes, 30 minutes at the most. But of course, once the technology hits the market, people can spend as much time as they like immersed. And there's no evidence in that I know of. No one knows what the effects will be. And I think that's another thing, that's another concrete recommendation we make, that users should be made aware that we really don't know the effects of long-term immersion. It might be nothing to worry about, but who knows? At least we should say we don't know. And yeah, I'll say a few things about that later. So I talked about robotic re-embodiment earlier, this idea of putting oneself, instead of embodying an avatar, putting oneself into the body of a robot. I'm going to mention this experiment, let's see if we can show some video. This is a subject lying in an fMRI scanner in Israel, he imagines his left arm to move the robot left. He imagines his right arm to move the robot right. He imagines walking to move the robot forward. The robot is in France. And so what you see in the bottom left is what the subject sees through the eyes of the robot. It's nothing you see in, it's not Hollywood yet, but we're getting there. This is the first time in history, I think we can say that we have a human being performing actions in the world completely bypassing the body, just through consciousness alone. And that's something to think about. Now, it's cool in itself. Why am I mentioning it here? We've heard a lot about 360 cameras. I think we could start thinking and talking about, so 360 cameras are stationary typically. Let's put them on the robots, and that's another thing to think about. It's another option. That's just just something to think about. Okay. So two main themes: environment and embodiment. Now I'm just going to I'm going to just sort of pick up remaining issues one after another. We heard already today about how 3D scanners are going to be widely available in cell phones soon. We're going to be able to create avatars. We're going to be able to create avatars of ourselves relatively easily. Now, what kinds of ethical risks might that raise? Well, we've heard about body swapping. Experimenting with body swapping, that could be psychologically tricky. It depends on who you swap bodies with, I guess, well, you can use your imagination there, but we advise caution with that. You can create an avatar of someone, and then well, we're all going to die someday, but our avatars won't. So we can imagine someone grieving, spending a lot of time with the avatar of a loved one who they've lost. That could be good. We don't know, but that's again, we advise caution with that. People are going to be using the technology in new ways, and that's another example where I think people should be warned to be very careful with those kinds of applications. Avatar ownership is going to be controversial. We can imagine someone getting very attached to their avatar to the point that they feel as if their avatar is more who they are than their actual physical body. Now imagine someone with malicious intent coming in and creating a look-alike avatar and having it do really unpleasant things. This happened way back in the days of multi-user dungeons with a virtual rape, and just in a text-based situation. So we can imagine how possibly traumatic that could be when you see an avatar who may look just like you being controlled by someone else. There are no regulations about that right now, but we need to start talking about that. Another remaining issue, further research will not reveal risks for the most vulnerable. So I've talked about how we're calling for further research on long-term immersion. Now, because the research will be carried out according to ethical rules, people such as children and individuals perhaps with latent mental illness are going to be excluded from those studies. So we won't even know So we can maybe do the research on long-term immersion for people who are not at risk, but for ethical constraints, we can't even do the research for those who are most at risk. This is after dinner one night, I showed a VR demonstration on YouTube, and my 3-year-old daughter saw it. 5 minutes later, I found her. She went and grabbed her toy smartphone and made her own and started pretending to be in VR. So children are going to think this is really cool. They're going to want to do this, but their brains are not yet developed yet. Their visual systems are not yet developed yet. There are risks there. So we need to be careful there. 2 more remaining issues. Social interaction. We're going to be interacting a lot with each other, or one possible exciting area for VR is going to be the merging between VR and social media. You won't have to Skype anymore. You can have an in-the-flesh experience with people who are very far away. Now, that's going to be great. Now, we might have opportunities for enhanced social interaction, say through biometrics. We can have visual representations of our bodily states while we're interacting through VR. But there are also risks. We might ask, what do we lose if virtual social interaction starts to increasingly replace in the flesh, face-to-face social interaction? And here's a study that is relevant here. Is from older adults in the United States are more at they have a higher risk of depression or lower social interaction. The lower in the flesh social interaction puts them at higher risk for depression. No matter email, written word, telephone calls, none of that seems to matter. It's face-to-face interaction that correlates with mental health there. So that's a question. Another question to ask. We'll have we don't have to visit grandmother. We can just go and visit her in virtual environment. Well, that might not be as good. We don't know why, but it's something to consider. Finally, new concerns about privacy, as we've been talking, as we've already heard in here today. To make the most use of this technology, we're going to be sharing physiological information, whether it be facial expressions, heart rate, skin response, and so on. That, on one hand, that will enhance our experience, but on the other hand, we're going to be sharing, as I think as William said this morning, it's, if you thought your Google trail was cool, wait till you see the trail that you're going to leave with this. Well, of course, that raises new issues about privacy. So I don't know how urgently we have to worry about that. It's not like a big company that has had controversial privacy issues of getting into VR, so I don't know. Okay, thank you.